That evening, I was walking through Central Park after another exhausting day at the accounting firm, clutching a warm cup of coffee and a sandwich I'd grabbed from the corner deli. The autumn air was crisp and most people hurried past, eager to get home. But then I noticed her, a frail, elderly homeless woman sitting on a bench, her weathered hands wrapped around a thin blanket that barely covered her shoulders. Her eyes, though tired, held an intensity that stopped me in my tracks. Without thinking, I approached and offered her half of my sandwich. She accepted it with a grateful nod, then surprised me by pulling out a crumpled piece of paper with a phone number scrawled across it in faded ink. "Call me," she said, her voice hoarse but commanding, "when you've lost everything and need someone who understands revenge." Before we dive into today's storytelling session, tell us where you are watching from and add like and subscribe to this section so we can continue bringing you these compelling narratives. 3 weeks later, when my world had completely collapsed, I found myself dialing that number. The woman who answered wasn't the frail homeless person I'd met in the park. Her voice was sharp, calculated, and when we met at a small cafe in Queens, I realized I was staring at someone far more dangerous than I'd imagined. "I know they've destroyed you, Janet," she said, her piercing blue eyes never leaving mine. "Work with me. We'll make them pay for what they've taken from you and your daughter." My name is Janet Stone and I'm 32 years old. To understand why I was sitting across from this mysterious woman, listening to her promise of revenge, I need to tell you my story from the beginning, from my childhood in Detroit's forgotten neighborhoods to the moment everything I'd built came crashing down. I was born in a cramped apartment in Detroit's East Side, where the sound of factory sirens mixed with sirens of a different kind, police cars racing through streets where hope had died long ago. My mother, Linda Stone, worked double shifts at a textile factory, her fingers permanently stained with dye, her back bent from years of hunching over sewing machines. My father had left when I was 3, leaving behind only a note that said he wasn't cut out for this life. Our apartment was a testament to making do with nothing. The walls were thin enough that we could hear every argument, every crying baby, every late-night fight from our neighbors. The radiator clanged through winter nights, providing just enough warmth to keep us from freezing. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in, but it was where my mother would sit with me every evening, helping me with homework under a flickering fluorescent light. "Education is your way out, baby," she would tell me, her tired eyes still managing to sparkle with determination. "I don't care if we have to eat beans and rice for months, you're going to college and you're going to make something of yourself." Those words became my mantra. While other kids in my neighborhood were getting into trouble, I buried myself in books. I read everything I could get my hands on, novels from the library, textbooks my teachers let me borrow, even old encyclopedias I found in dumpsters behind the school. My mother would find me reading by candlelight when the electricity was shut off, and instead of scolding me, she'd sit beside me and read along. The neighborhood I grew up in was unforgiving. Drug dealers operated openly on street corners, gunshots echoed through the night, and too many of my classmates disappeared into cycles of poverty and violence that seemed impossible to escape. But my mother created a bubble of safety around our small apartment, filling it with books, hope, and the unwavering belief that I could rise above our circumstances. When I was 10, our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was evicted along with her 3 children. I watched from our window as their belongings were piled on the sidewalk, her youngest daughter crying as strangers picked through their possessions. That night, my mother held me while I cried and made me promise I would never let anyone make me feel powerless. "Power," she told me, "comes from knowledge and independence. No one can take away what's in your head, and if you can support yourself, you'll never have to depend on anyone else's mercy." My mother kept her word about my education. When I needed books, she worked extra hours. When I needed a computer for school projects, she saved every penny for months, eating nothing but peanut butter sandwiches for lunch so she could put aside $20 from each paycheck. When I got accepted to the University of Michigan with a partial scholarship, she cried tears of joy and worked 3 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't. I remember the day I left for college, standing in the doorway of our tiny apartment with my single suitcase and a backpack full of books. My mother hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, whispering prayers and promises that she would be there for every phone call, every holiday, every moment I needed her. College was like stepping into an alien world. My classmates talked casually about summer homes, spring break trips to Europe, and internships their parents had arranged through family connections. I wore the same 5 outfits rotated throughout the week and worked 20 hours in the campus cafeteria to afford textbooks. The dining hall supervisor, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, would let me take home leftover food at the end of my shifts, which often constituted my only real meal of the day. But I thrived academically, majoring in accounting with a minor in business administration. Numbers made sense to me in a way that nothing else did. They were honest, predictable, immune to the kind of manipulation and deception I'd witnessed growing up. I loved the precision required, the way everything had to balance perfectly, the satisfaction of finding errors and correcting them. My professors began to notice my dedication. Dr. Harrison, who taught advanced financial analysis, started giving me extra assignments not as punishment, but as opportunities to challenge myself. He told me I had a natural talent for detecting irregularities in financial statements, a skill that would serve me well in professional auditing. During my junior year, I interned at a small accounting firm in Ann Arbor, working for free in exchange for experience and course credit. The partners, impressed by my work ethic and attention to detail, offered me a part-time position during my senior year. For the first time in my life, I was earning decent money, enough to send some home to my mother and still have money left over for proper meals and new clothes. The day I graduated with honors, my mother sat in the front row wearing a new dress, the first new clothing she'd bought for herself in years. She'd lost weight from working so much, her hands were more scarred than ever from the factory work, but her smile was radiant as she watched me walk across the stage. "That's my daughter," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "That's my baby up there." After graduation, I moved to New York City with $800 in my pocket and a fierce determination to build a better life. The transition was brutal. I'd thought Detroit was harsh, but New York was relentlessly expensive and competitive. My first apartment was a studio in Queens that was barely larger than a closet, with thin walls, no air conditioning, and a bathroom I shared with 3 other tenants. I survived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, sending out hundreds of job applications while working temporary administrative jobs to pay rent. The rejection letters piled up on my tiny desk. "We've decided to pursue other candidates. Your qualifications don't match our current needs. We'll keep your resume on file." Each rejection felt personal, a reminder that despite my education and determination, I was still an outsider trying to break into a world that didn't want me. Finally, after 3 months of rejections, Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in Manhattan, offered me a position as a junior accountant. The salary was modest, but it was my foot in the door to the world I'd dreamed of entering. I called my mother that night, both of us crying with relief that I'd finally found my chance. The early years at Morrison & Associates were a whirlwind of late nights, demanding clients, and learning the intricate dance of corporate finance. I threw myself into every project with the same intensity I'd shown in college. While my colleagues went out for drinks after work, I stayed late, double-checking numbers, learning new software, and studying for my CPA certification. The other junior accountants found my intensity off-putting. During lunch breaks, they would discuss weekend plans, expensive restaurants, and shopping trips I couldn't afford. I would eat my packed lunch at my desk and continue working, knowing that I couldn't rely on family connections or financial cushions the way they could. I had to be not just good, but exceptional. My dedication paid off. Within 3 years, I was promoted to senior accountant, then audit manager. I was building a reputation as someone you could trust with the most complex financial cases, someone who could find discrepancies that others missed and explain complicated financial structures in clear, understandable terms. Mr. Morrison himself, a stern but fair man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, began assigning me to the firm's most important clients. He called me into his office one Thursday afternoon, gesturing for me to sit in the leather chair across from his massive oak desk. "Janet," he said, removing his reading glasses and looking at me seriously. You have a gift for this work. I've been in this business for 35 years, and I rarely see someone with your combination of technical skill and intuitive understanding of financial irregularities. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. I'm assigning you to lead the Blackwood Corporation audit. It's our largest client, and this quarterly review is critical. Are you ready for this level of responsibility? I felt my heart racing but kept my voice steady. Yes, sir. I won't let you down. That's when I met the Blackwood Corporation. Blackwood Corp was one of those companies that seemed to have its fingers in everything: real estate development, technology investments, media holdings, luxury hotels, and even a small chain of high-end restaurants. The CEO, Richard Blackwood, was old-money New York royalty, the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers and donated wings to hospitals that bore his family name. His great-grandfather had made the family fortune in railroads, his grandfather had expanded into steel production, and his father had diversified into modern financial services. I was assigned to lead their quarterly audit, a massive undertaking that required examining millions of dollars in transactions across dozens of subsidiaries. It should have been the highlight of my career. At 28, I was the youngest person ever to handle such a significant client for Morrison & Associates. Working on the Blackwood account meant spending time at their gleaming Manhattan headquarters, a 40-story tower with marble floors and artwork that cost more than most people's houses. The lobby featured a waterfall, original paintings by artists I'd studied in college art history courses, and a security desk staffed by men in expensive suits who looked more like Secret Service agents than building guards. The Blackwood offices occupied the top 10 floors of the building, with each department spread across carefully designed spaces that spoke of wealth and power. The executive floor, where I conducted most of my meetings, had conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and hallways lined with photographs of Richard Blackwood meeting with presidents, celebrities, and other titans of industry. It was there that I met Michael Blackwood, Richard's son and the heir apparent to the family empire. Michael was everything I wasn't: tall, confident, educated at Harvard Business School, comfortable in a world of privilege I could barely comprehend. At 30, he had the kind of easy charm that comes from never doubting your place in the world. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his suits were custom-tailored, and he moved through the Blackwood offices like a prince touring his kingdom. But he was also kind, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my work and my opinions about the company's financial strategies. Unlike other executives I'd encountered, who treated accountants like necessary but invisible functionaries, Michael asked detailed questions about my analysis and listened carefully to my explanations. Our relationship began innocently enough. He would stop by during my audits to ask questions about the reports I was preparing, settling into the chair across from my temporary desk and asking about specific transactions or investment strategies. Those conversations gradually shifted from business to personal topics. "You didn't grow up in New York," he observed during one of our early conversations, watching me navigate the company's financial software with practiced ease. "Detroit," I replied, not looking up from my screen. "Very different from this." "Tell me about it," he said, and something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. He seemed genuinely curious, not making polite conversation but actually wanting to know about my background. I told him about the textile factory where my mother worked, about the neighborhood where gunshots were part of the nighttime soundtrack, about working in the campus dining hall to afford textbooks. Instead of the polite but uncomfortable silence I'd learned to expect when discussing my background with wealthy colleagues, Michael asked thoughtful questions and shared his own stories about feeling disconnected from his privileged upbringing. "Sometimes I think people from backgrounds like yours understand business better than those of us who inherited it," he said. "You know what it means when the numbers don't add up because you've lived with real consequences." The first time he asked me to dinner, I almost said no. I knew the rules about mixing business with personal relationships, especially when it involved such an important client. But something about Michael made me want to break those rules. "There's this little Italian place in Greenwich Village," he said, standing in the doorway of my temporary office. Nothing fancy, but they make the best osso buco in the city. Would you like to join me tomorrow evening? I looked up from my computer screen, acutely aware of the stack of financial documents on my desk, the ongoing audit that demanded my attention, and the professional boundaries I'd sworn to maintain. But I also noticed the way Michael's eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the genuine warmth in his voice, and the fact that he'd chosen a small neighborhood restaurant rather than one of the expensive Manhattan establishments his family frequented. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with the decision. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully. Michael would take me to restaurants I'd only read about in magazines, introduce me to wines I couldn't pronounce, show me a New York I'd never imagined existed. We attended off-Broadway shows, visited small galleries in Soho, and spent Saturday afternoons walking through Central Park while he told me stories about growing up in the city. But he also seemed to understand my world in ways that surprised me. He asked thoughtful questions about growing up in Detroit, about my mother's sacrifices, about the weight of being the first person in my family to graduate college. When I told him about working multiple jobs to afford textbooks, he didn't offer sympathy but respect. "You earned everything you have," he said during one of our walks through the park. "I've never had to do that. Sometimes I wonder if I would have had the strength to fight as hard as you did." For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could be myself around someone from a completely different social class. Michael didn't make me feel ashamed of my background. If anything, he seemed to admire my determination and work ethic. When I told him about my mother's long hours at the factory, he listened with the kind of attention I'd never received from men who'd grown up with housekeepers and gardeners. Our relationship deepened over months of dinners, theater performances, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Michael introduced me to his friends, other young professionals from wealthy families who treated me with polite curiosity rather than the condescension I'd feared. I met his sister Victoria, a sharp-tongued woman 2 years younger who worked in art curation, and slowly began to understand the complex dynamics of the Blackwood family. 6 months after we started dating, Michael proposed. Not in some grand public gesture, but quietly in my tiny Queens apartment, sitting on my second-hand couch while we ate Chinese takeout and watched an old movie on my small television. "I know this isn't the life you're used to," I told him, gesturing around my cramped living space with its mismatched furniture and kitchen barely large enough for one person. He took my hands and said, "Janet, I've never been happier anywhere than I am right here with you. You've shown me what it means to build something from nothing, to work for what you believe in. I don't want to live without that kind of honesty in my life." The engagement ring was beautiful but not ostentatious, a classic solitaire that spoke of elegance rather than showiness. When I called my mother to tell her the news, she cried and asked me 3 times if I was sure he was a good man. "He is, Mom," I assured her. "He's nothing like the men you warned me about. He respects my work, he listens when I talk, and he makes me feel like I belong wherever I am." The wedding planning revealed the first cracks in what I'd thought was our perfect relationship. Michael's family had expectations about venues, guest lists, and traditions that hadn't occurred to me. Catherine Blackwood, his mother, suggested several expensive Manhattan hotels and seemed genuinely confused when I mentioned budget concerns. "Darling," she said during one particularly tense planning session, "you mustn't worry about expenses. This is a Blackwood wedding and we have certain standards to maintain." The wedding was ultimately held at a boutique hotel in Manhattan, beautiful but far more elaborate than anything I'd envisioned. My mother flew in from Detroit, overwhelmed by the elegance but beaming with pride as she met the Blackwood family and their wealthy friends. I could see her trying to navigate conversations about charity galas and summer homes, holding her own with the quiet dignity she'd always possessed. The Blackwood family attended, though I could feel their polite disapproval in every forced smile and measured compliment. Catherine Blackwood made several comments about how refreshing it was to have someone from such a different background joining the family. Victoria was more direct, pulling me aside during the reception to ask if I was sure I understood what I was getting into. "Michael's always been the idealistic one," she said, sipping her champagne and watching her brother dance with my mother. "But good intentions don't always survive family expectations." Richard Blackwood himself pulled me aside during the reception, his voice cordial but his message clear. "I hope you understand the responsibility that comes with being part of this family, Janet. We have a reputation to maintain, business relationships that depend on stability and discretion." I assured him I did, though I wasn't entirely sure what he meant at the time. Looking back, I realized that conversation was his way of establishing the ground rules. I could be Michael's wife, but I would always be expected to serve the family's interests first. After the wedding, Michael and I moved into a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side. The space was larger than any place I'd ever lived, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a kitchen with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, and a master bedroom suite larger than my mother's entire apartment. My mother visited once, walking through the rooms in stunned silence before sitting on the designer sofa and crying. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she said. "You've made it further than I ever dreamed possible. Your father would have been amazed to see this." But success, I was learning, came with complications I hadn't anticipated. Being a Blackwood meant attending charity galas where people discussed their vacation homes in the Hamptons, board meetings where family members treated me like an outsider who'd gotten lucky, and social events where I constantly felt like I was being evaluated and found lacking. The charity circuit was particularly challenging. Michael's family was expected to attend numerous fundraising events throughout the year, each requiring expensive evening gowns and the ability to make conversation with New York's social elite. I learned to navigate these events by listening carefully and asking thoughtful questions, but I never felt completely comfortable in a world where people casually discussed spending more on a single dinner than my mother earned in a month. Michael tried to shield me from the worst of it, but I could see the strain it put on his relationship with his family. His mother, Catherine Blackwood, barely spoke to me directly, communicating through Michael or simply ignoring my presence altogether. His sister Victoria made snide comments about new money trying to buy class, apparently forgetting that I had no money at all when I married into the family. The real problems began when I became pregnant with Emma. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. I was exhausted constantly, battling severe morning sickness that lasted well into the second trimester. My doctor, recommended by Catherine Blackwood and practicing on the Upper East Side, was kind but clinical, treating my pregnancy like a condition to be managed rather than a natural process to be celebrated. Michael was attentive and caring, bringing me tea when I couldn't keep anything else down and holding my hair back during the worst of the morning sickness. But I could see him struggling with his own concerns about how the pregnancy would affect my work and our social obligations. My doctor recommended I reduce my workload, but I was in the middle of several major audits, including ongoing work for Blackwood Corporation. Morrison and Associates was understanding about my condition, but I felt pressure to maintain my high standards of work even as my energy flagged and concentration became more difficult. That's when I started noticing discrepancies in Blackwood's financial records. At first, they seemed like simple errors, money transferred to subsidiaries that didn't match the amounts recorded in the main books, payments to consulting firms I couldn't track down, investment losses that disappeared and reappeared in different quarters. As an experienced auditor, I knew these kinds of inconsistencies usually pointed to larger problems, but the pregnancy was affecting my ability to focus for long periods, and I initially dismissed them as oversight on my part. But the discrepancies were persistent and growing. Large sums of money were being moved through a complex network of subsidiary companies, many of which seemed to exist only on paper. Investment returns were being artificially inflated through carefully timed transactions, and several major contracts appeared to have been secured through payments that weren't properly documented. I brought my concerns to Michael first, thinking he could help me understand the company's complex structure. We were having dinner at home, and I'd spread several financial documents across our dining room table, trying to trace the flow of money through various Blackwood subsidiaries. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a series of transactions that had been bothering me for days. Blackwood Development transferred $2 million to Blackwood Holdings, but there's no record of what the money was used for. Then, 3 days later, Blackwood Holdings made a payment to something called Metropolitan Consulting Group, which I can't find any information about. Michael looked at the documents, his expression growing tense as he followed my analysis. But when I showed him the discrepancies I'd found, his reaction was strange, not confused or curious but worried. "Maybe you should focus on other accounts right now," he suggested, gathering the papers and closing the folders. "The pregnancy is already stressing you out, and you're probably seeing problems that aren't really there." His dismissive tone caught me off guard. Michael had always respected my professional judgment, asking detailed questions about my work and trusting my analysis. This was the first time he'd suggested I might be making errors, and it felt like a fundamental shift in how he saw me. But I couldn't let it go. The numbers didn't add up, and as someone who'd built her career on precision and accuracy, I felt compelled to dig deeper. Over the next several weeks, I continued investigating during my lunch breaks and after hours, carefully documenting every irregular transaction I found. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Blackwood Corporation wasn't just making accounting errors, they were systematically embezzling money from their investors, laundering funds through shell companies, and bribing city officials to secure development contracts. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking, involving millions of dollars and reaching into every level of the company. Blackwood Development was billing clients for construction projects that were never completed, pocketing the difference and using forged completion certificates to close the contracts. Blackwood Holdings was taking money from pension funds and charitable investments, investing them in high-risk ventures, and using profits from legitimate investments to cover losses when the risky bets failed. Most disturbing of all, I found evidence of payments to city planning officials, building inspectors, and even several judges involved in zoning disputes. Richard Blackwood wasn't just running a successful company, he was operating a criminal enterprise that had been corrupting New York's development process for years. I documented everything carefully, building a file that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Bank transfers, forged documents, recorded conversations between executives discussing how to hide their illegal activities. I copied everything onto encrypted drives and stored them in a safety deposit box, knowing that if I was right about the scope of the crimes, I would need protection. When I confronted Michael with the evidence, I expected shock, outrage, demands that we immediately turn everything over to the authorities. Instead, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, fear, but not fear of the crimes I'd uncovered. Fear of what I might do with the information. We were in our living room and I'd spread the evidence across our coffee table, bank statements, forged contracts, copies of emails between Richard and various city officials. Michael looked at everything in silence, his face growing paler as he processed the implications. "Janet," he said carefully, "you need to understand how complicated this situation is. There are a lot of people whose lives could be destroyed if this information becomes public." "People's lives are already being destroyed," I replied, pointing to a file containing information about pension funds that had lost millions to Blackwood schemes. Pension funds, charities, investors who trusted your family with their money. How can you know about this and not want to stop it? Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything, "Because stopping it would mean destroying our family, and I won't let that happen." The way he said "our family," with such finality, such resignation, made me realize that this conversation wasn't about right and wrong. It was about choosing sides, and Michael had already made his choice. "You knew," I said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "You've known all along." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "Not the details, but yes, I knew the family business involved, questionable practices. I thought I could change things gradually from the inside. I thought having someone like you around would help us transition to more legitimate operations." I realized then that Michael hadn't married me despite knowing about his family's crimes. He'd married me because of them. I was the perfect cover, an honest accountant whose reputation would help legitimize their operations. My integrity had become their shield. The confrontation escalated quickly. Michael begged me to keep quiet, promising that they would gradually phase out the illegal activities, find legal ways to repay what they'd stolen. He talked about our future together, our unborn child, the life we could have if I would just trust the family to handle the situation internally. But I couldn't live with that knowledge, couldn't pretend that my husband's wealth wasn't built on the financial destruction of innocent people. Every time I looked at our beautiful apartment, at the expensive furniture and artwork, I would know it had been purchased with stolen money. "I can't do this, Michael," I told him, my hands resting on my growing belly. "I won't raise our child in a house built on lies and theft. Either your family voluntarily discloses everything to the authorities, or I will." I made the mistake of trusting him with my ultimatum, believing that our love and the prospect of becoming parents would motivate him to do the right thing. I gave him a week to convince his family to come forward, to work with prosecutors to minimize the damage and begin making restitution to their victims. Instead, within days, everything began unraveling, not for the Blackwood family, but for me. First, I was fired from Morrison and Associates. The official reason was performance issues related to pregnancy complications, but I knew the truth. Richard Blackwood had made a phone call, and suddenly my 15-year career was over. Mr. Morrison called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, his expression sad but resolute. "Janet, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "There have been concerns raised about your recent work quality and given your condition." "What concerns?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "From which client?" He didn't need to say it. We both knew that losing the Blackwood account would be a devastating blow to the firm, and keeping me employed wasn't worth that risk. Then the lawyers came. Not to defend me, but to attack me. The Blackwood family claimed I'd been embezzling from their accounts, using my position as their auditor to steal money and hide it in offshore accounts. They had documents forged, but sophisticated enough to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. The accusations were detailed and damning. They claimed I'd been skimming money from client accounts for months, using my access to the company's financial systems to transfer funds to accounts under false names. They produced bank statements showing deposits that corresponded to dates when I'd handled specific transactions, and they had witnesses, other Blackwood employees, who swore they'd seen me acting suspiciously. Michael stood by his family's lies. The man who'd held my hands and promised to love me forever testified that he'd discovered my theft and was planning to file for divorce to protect his family's interests. In his statement to the police, he claimed that my accusations against his family were desperate attempts to deflect attention from my own crimes. But the cruelest blow came when they moved to take Emma away from me. Emma was born during the height of the legal battle, a beautiful, perfect baby girl who deserved so much better than the chaos surrounding her arrival. I went into labor 3 weeks early, possibly triggered by the stress of the ongoing investigation. Michael wasn't there. He was meeting with lawyers, preparing his family's defense against my baseless accusations. I held Emma in my arms in the hospital room, looking into her perfect face and promising her that I would find a way to protect her from the darkness that had consumed her father's family. She had Michael's dark hair but my eyes, and when she looked at me, I felt a fierce protective love unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The Blackwoods immediately filed for emergency custody, claiming I was an unfit mother whose criminal activities and mental instability made me a danger to the child. They had resources I couldn't match: teams of lawyers, private investigators who dug up every embarrassing detail of my childhood, psychiatrists who testified that my accusations against the family were evidence of postpartum psychosis. They painted a picture of me as a delusional woman who'd become obsessed with destroying the family that had welcomed me, willing to sacrifice my own child's welfare to pursue my vengeful fantasies. They claimed that my accusations were the product of a disturbed mind, that I was so consumed with jealousy and resentment that I'd invented an elaborate conspiracy theory to explain my own failures. I sat in family court with an overworked public defender, watching Michael's lawyers present their case for why my daughter should be raised by the very family whose crimes I'd tried to expose. Michael wouldn't even look at me, sitting with his parents and sister like I was a stranger who'd somehow infiltrated their perfect lives. The judge, probably influenced by the Blackwood family's reputation and charitable contributions, awarded temporary custody to Michael and his family, pending the outcome of the criminal charges against me. I was allowed supervised visits twice a week, 2 hours at a time, in a sterile room with a social worker taking notes on every interaction between me and my own daughter. Emma would reach for me during those visits, her tiny hands grasping at my face, and I would hold her and whisper promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "Mama's going to fix this, baby girl. I'm going to find a way to bring you home." But as the months passed, my situation only got worse. The legal fees bankrupted me quickly, criminal defense attorneys were expensive, and the Blackwood family's resources allowed them to drag out every proceeding, forcing me to spend money I didn't have on depositions, expert witnesses, and court filings. My reputation was destroyed overnight. No accounting firm would hire someone facing embezzlement charges, and my professional licenses were suspended pending the outcome of the case. I was forced to take temporary work, data entry, house cleaning, anything that would pay enough to cover my legal fees and the bare minimum of living expenses. I moved back to a studio apartment in Queens, not much different from the one I'd lived in 15 years earlier when I first moved to New York. But this time, instead of hope and determination, I was consumed by grief and rage. The walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and every night I would lie awake listening to the city sounds and wondering how I'd lost everything so completely. The criminal trial was a sham from the beginning. The prosecution, armed with the forged documents and bought testimony, painted me as a greedy woman who'd married into wealth and then tried to steal even more. My defense attorney, overwhelmed and underfunded, couldn't compete with the Blackwood legal machine. The prosecutor, an ambitious young man named Daniel Walsh, treated the case like a career-making opportunity. He presented me as the villain in a story of betrayal and greed, a woman who'd used her position of trust to steal from the very family that had welcomed her into their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said during his closing argument, "Janet Stone had everything, a successful career, a loving husband, a beautiful home. But it wasn't enough. She wanted more, and she was willing to steal it from the people who trusted her most." I sat at the defendant's table, 7 months pregnant and exhausted from the stress of the trial, listening to him describe crimes I'd never committed while the real criminals sat in the gallery watching justice be perverted to serve their interests. I was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The judge, in announcing the sentence, lectured me about betraying the trust placed in me and the damage I'd done to my profession's reputation. He seemed to genuinely believe the story the Blackwoods had constructed, and his disappointment felt almost as crushing as the verdict itself. The day they led me away in handcuffs, I looked back at the courtroom and saw Michael sitting with Emma on his lap. My daughter was 9 months old, and when she saw me, she smiled and reached out her arms. I wanted to run to her, to hold her one more time, but the bailiffs pushed me forward toward a future that seemed impossibly dark. Prison was exactly as brutal as I'd feared, but in ways I hadn't expected. The other inmates either saw me as an easy target, a white-collar criminal who'd grown soft living in luxury, or they resented me for the wealth they assumed I'd stolen. I learned to keep my head down, avoid conflicts, and count the days until I could see Emma again. The worst part wasn't the violence or the isolation, it was the letters from my mother. She wrote every week, her handwriting growing shakier as her arthritis worsened, always asking when I would be coming home and whether Emma was safe. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth about the custody battle, couldn't destroy her faith in the justice system she'd taught me to respect. I spent my time in prison reading legal books, learning about appeals processes and custody law. I worked in the prison library, helping other inmates with their cases while researching my own options. The law librarian, a woman named Sarah who'd been convicted of tax fraud after her husband abandoned her with massive debts, became my mentor and closest friend during those dark months. "The system is designed to break people like us," she told me one afternoon as we organized legal texts in the cramped library. "Women who trusted the wrong people, who got caught up in other people's crimes. But knowledge is power, Janet. Learn everything you can about the law because when you get out, you'll need every advantage you can get." I followed her advice, spending every free moment studying precedents and case law, writing appeals that were inevitably denied, and preparing for the custody battle I knew would continue after my release. But when I was released after serving 18 months, I discovered that the Blackwoods had moved to make Emma's custody permanent. Michael had remarried, a woman named Clarissa Worthington from another wealthy New York family, someone who could provide the stable home environment that I supposedly couldn't offer as a convicted felon. The marriage had taken place 6 months after I'd been sent to prison, a quiet ceremony at the Blackwood family estate in the Hamptons. The wedding photos, which I saw in a society magazine at the prison library, showed Michael smiling beside a blonde woman in an expensive dress, with Emma serving as flower girl. My supervised visits were reduced to once a month. Emma, now over 2 years old, barely remembered me. She called Michael's new wife Mama, and hid behind Michael's legs when I tried to hug her during our court-mandated visits at a sterile family services center. "Hi, Emma," I would say, kneeling down to her level while a social worker observed from the corner. "Do you remember me? I'm your mama." Emma would shake her head and cling to the social worker, sometimes crying when I tried to interact with her. The reports from these visits described her as anxious and distressed by my presence, which the Blackwood legal team used as evidence that continued contact was harmful to her psychological development. I found work cleaning offices at night, a job that paid minimum wage and required no background check. During the day, I fought a legal system that seemed determined to keep me away from my daughter. My appeals were denied, my requests for increased visitation rejected, my attempts to present new evidence dismissed. The public defender assigned to my custody case was well-meaning but overwhelmed, handling dozens of similar cases with minimal resources. She advised me to accept the reality of my situation and be grateful for the monthly visits I was allowed. "Mrs. Stone," she said during one of our brief meetings in the courthouse hallway, "you have to understand that the judge sees a convicted felon with no stable income trying to gain custody from a wealthy, stable family. Unless you can prove your innocence of the embezzlement charges or demonstrate that the Blackwoods are unfit parents, the court isn't going to change its position." But proving my innocence seemed impossible. The evidence against me had been expertly fabricated, and the Blackwood family's resources allowed them to counter every legal move I attempted. Worse, my conviction had damaged my credibility so thoroughly that even sympathetic lawyers warned me that juries would be unlikely to believe my version of events. I lived in a studio apartment in Queens that reminded me painfully of my early days in New York, before I'd built my career and fallen in love with Michael. But this time, instead of hope and determination driving me forward, I was consumed by grief and rage. Every night, I would lie awake thinking about Emma growing up in a house built on stolen money, being raised by people who thought they could buy their way out of any consequences. The final blow came 6 months after my release. I was walking through Central Park after another failed court hearing when I saw them, Michael, his new wife Clarissa, and Emma feeding ducks by the pond. Emma was laughing, running between them, calling them both Daddy and Mama like they were the only parents she'd ever known. Emma had grown so much in the months since I'd seen her. She was tall for her age, with long dark hair that Clarissa had braided with pink ribbons. She wore an expensive coat and tiny designer boots, looking every inch the pampered child of wealth and privilege. I stood behind a tree and watched my daughter's life continue without me, realizing that the Blackwoods had won completely. They'd stolen my career, my freedom, my reputation, and finally my child. Emma would grow up thinking I'd abandoned her, never knowing that I'd tried desperately to stay in her life. Clarissa was everything I wasn't, blonde, polished, born into the kind of family that summered in Martha's Vineyard and sent their children to exclusive private schools. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never worried about paying rent or affording decent food. As I watched them together, I saw Emma stumble while chasing a duck. Clarissa immediately swept her up, checking for injuries with the kind of practiced maternal care that I'd never been allowed to develop. Emma laughed and hugged her, completely comfortable in her adoptive mother's arms. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment and seriously considered ending it all. What was the point of continuing to fight when I'd lost everything that mattered? Emma would grow up thinking I'd abandoned her, never knowing that I'd tried desperately to stay in her life. My mother's letters from Detroit had stopped coming. I later learned she'd died of a heart attack while I was in prison, probably brought on by the stress of seeing her daughter's life destroyed. I stared at the bottle of sleeping pills I'd been prescribed for the insomnia that had plagued me since my release, thinking about how easy it would be to take them all and simply not wake up. The pain would stop, the humiliation would end, and maybe Emma would be better off not having to explain why her biological mother was a convicted criminal. But then I remembered the piece of paper in my wallet, the phone number the homeless woman had given me weeks earlier. I'd carried it with me through everything, the trial, prison, the custody battles, like a talisman I'd never thought I'd actually use. When you've lost everything and need someone who understands revenge. I had lost everything. My career, my reputation, my freedom, my child, even my mother. And I was ready for revenge. The voice that answered the phone was nothing like the frail homeless woman I'd met in the park. It was sharp, intelligent, and when she spoke, I could hear decades of anger barely held in check. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "My name is Margaret Blackwood, and I think it's time we had a proper conversation about my family." We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Queens, far from Manhattan and the world of wealth and power that had destroyed my life. When I arrived, the woman sitting at the corner table bore no resemblance to the frail homeless person who'd accepted half my sandwich. Margaret Blackwood was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple but expensive coat and carried herself with the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of privilege. But there was something harder in her expression, a bitterness that spoke of deep betrayals and long-nursed grievances. "You look surprised," she said as I sat down across from her. "I suppose Richard's version of family history doesn't include much about the sister he had declared mentally incompetent and locked away." She ordered coffee for both of us and began to tell me a story that explained everything: why the Blackwood fortune existed, how it had been built, and why she'd spent the last 20 years living in the shadows, gathering evidence against her own family. "My father built Blackwood Corporation through hard work and legitimate business practices," Margaret said, her voice steady but filled with old pain. "When he died, Richard was supposed to honor his wishes, to run the company ethically, to take care of family members, to use our wealth responsibly. Instead, Richard had systematically destroyed anyone who stood in his way. He'd had Margaret declared mentally incompetent after she'd discovered his early forays into embezzlement and money laundering, using bought psychiatric evaluations to have her committed to a private facility upstate. I spent 3 years in that place," she continued, her hand steady as she lifted her coffee cup. 3 years being told I was delusional, that my concerns about the company's finances were symptoms of paranoid delusions. Richard had me so thoroughly discredited that even when I was finally released, no one would listen to me. She'd been living under assumed names ever since, working menial jobs while carefully documenting her brother's crimes. She'd gathered evidence on dozens of fraudulent schemes, corrupt business deals, and even several suspicious deaths of people who'd threatened to expose Blackwood Corporation. "I've been waiting for someone like you, Janet," she said, leaning forward across the small table. "Someone who's seen their crimes firsthand, who has the accounting expertise to understand how the money flows, and who has nothing left to lose." Margaret had watched my case from the beginning, recognizing in my situation the same pattern of destruction she'd experienced decades earlier. She'd arranged to meet me in the park, posing as a homeless woman to test whether I had the compassion and integrity she'd need in an ally. "Help me bring them down," she said, "and I'll help you get Emma back. But you need to understand, this won't be quick and it won't be easy. Richard has spent years building networks of corrupt officials, bought judges, and complicit business partners. We'll have to be smarter and more patient than he is." Looking across that small cafe table at Margaret Blackwood, I realized this was my chance at justice, not just for myself, but for Emma, for my mother who'd died believing her daughter was a criminal, for every investor who'd been cheated by the Blackwood empire. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "This contains copies of documents I've been collecting for 20 years. Bank records, emails between Richard and his co-conspirators, evidence of bribes and intimidation. But I need someone with your skills to help me understand the complete scope of their operations and build a case that will stick. I thought about my daughter, growing up in a house built on lies and stolen money, being raised by people who thought they could buy their way out of any consequences. Emma deserved better than that. She deserved the truth. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope.